Most heartfelt greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen. I eagerly welcome you to Sturgeon's most premier station, Dusklight Radio, hosted by yours truly, the braggadociously bold, uniformly elusive, and brazenly erudite Everett J. Blackwell. Perhaps you know of us Blackwells. We operated one of Sturgeon's first tulpa clinics, See Me Now, ran by Esmeralda Aloysius Blackwell. Dr. Esmeralda, I mean. First woman in Sturgeon to get that sweet PhD. She shared the degree with her tulpa, Marmaduke, technically. She would be asked why her tulpa had a different name to hers, but she smiled and tapped her finger on the side of her nose. When her tulpa was asked, she'd say, "Loose lips sink ships," and refused to elaborate further. Charming woman. Hell of a backgammon player. Anyway, I'm Dusklight's main and most fabulous half-dead host. My job at this fine radio station is to bring you some of the most twisted, interesting, and downright bizarre tales that I and my wonderful many-legged runners collect from the far corners of Sturgeon and beyond. Some of them will make you laugh, some will make you cry, and some of you will want to take a trip to neighboring Dondella County. Listeners, our sponsor, the Dark Somnium, recently shared the first of a series of transmissions about Dondella, the first one entitled The Graves We Dig, as transcribed by our janitor, T.J. Lee. Continuing on with a county inside Sturgeon, this account details that of a heinous act and the genesis of something truly unusual. I actually have TJ here in a rarely seen lucid state. We may have put something special in his purple crayons, just long enough to tell you more. Take it away, TJ. Hello, listeners. TJ Lee here, somehow able to focus my mind and not want to smear purple crayon over my face. I hope you're all enjoying the content coming up on here. I wanted to talk to you very quickly about The Graves We Dig on the Dark Somnium's channel. This is a part of a wider project I have been working on for nearly 2 years now, and each chapter is a different POV and it's a different style of writing structure. So for example, the first one we did was in the style of H.P. Lovecraft, of August Derleth, of people in the gothic horror space, Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker. And that's designed to hook people in, but it gets very weird very quickly. Things we have in the book are like a choose-your-own-adventure novel, we have a play, we have a point-and-click video game style entry, transcripts, you name it, it's in there, and it's really fucking weird. And I wanted to kind of get ahead of it because I don't know when we're putting out parts 2 and 3, I think in the next few weeks. This is where I feel safe talking about it, and on the 5,000 subscriber mark we're about to get, I'm going to take the reins from Everett, and I will be talking about this in greater detail, and I'll be sharing a little bit of it with you. I'll also be putting up a text version of The Graves We Dig on the Patreon, and every sort of piece we do, I'll be revealing a bit more. I am very excited by this project because it is very near and dear to my heart, as much as it is about a wider issue in our world. It's not overly preachy, because I know some people don't like that, but it is very important to me, and if you love Dusklight, if you love Everett, if you love me, and you love Sturgeon, I am asking you to open your minds, open your hearts, and give this a chance. And I promise you, if you do, you will walk away with the greatest experience I have ever put to paper in my entire literary career. Now, if you'll excuse me, there's a purple crayon dictator that needs to be released from its gestation chamber. I suggest you cover your ears, Everett. Little Arya will be awakening soon, and your lineage will deplete. Oh dear. It's time for our featured stories from this evening's Dusklight Drive-In. For those of you unfamiliar, the Dusklight Drive-In is designed to showcase and promote classic science fiction and horror stories from the past 200 years, many of which are steadily being lost to time, though time itself is a fictitious construct created by great Gustav Blackwell to steal vitality, and we want to preserve those stories as best we can. The first one, The Thing That Walked on the Wind, was written by the great August Derleth almost a century ago in 1932. It details all the hallmarks of a cosmic horror story: an abandoned village, one incoherent survivor, and horrors beyond our comprehension. More can be found at our link below. Our second story is from one of the biggest giants in the science fiction scene, Sir Arthur C. Clarke. Bet you didn't know he dabbled in horror more than once, The story, A Walk in the Dark, chronicled in 1950, shows us that the deep darkness is always something to be afraid of. But how much of it is in your own mind when it's left to its own devices? We're about to find out, dear listeners. Special thanks must be given first to Mandy Moe for rendering yours truly in the beauteous image you see when you look at our page. And lastly, our music is provided with permission by Cryo Chamber, Invato Elements, and the Dark Somnium with gracious thanks. If you enjoy these intros and want to see more, please ensure you've got notifications on and leave a comment for every video you encounter. With that, the sun has set and dusk has crawled into the studio once more. Whether you're working, prepping to sleep, or evading the formless void that will one day consume us all, Blackwell is here to soothe your ears and captivate your soul. Now, close your eyes and take a deep breath. The scene has been set and the light is on. It's time to walk towards it. Statement of John Dalhousie, Division Chief of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, issued from temporary quarters at Nefissa Camp, Manitoba, 31st of October, 1931. This is my final word regarding the strange circumstances surrounding the disappearance of Constable Robert Norris from Nefissa Camp last March 7th, and the discovery of his body on the 17th of this month in a snowbank 4 miles north of here. My attitude in the matter will be clearly seen by the time the end of this statement is read. For the assistance of those to whom this matter is not so familiar, I want to chronicle briefly the facts leading up to it. On the 27th of February last, Robert Norris sent me the appended report, which apparently solved the now famed Stillwater mystery, a report which, for reasons that will be obvious, could not be released. On the 7th of the following month, Robert Norris vanished without leaving a trace. On the 17th of this October, his body was found deep in a snowbank 4 miles north of here. These are the known facts. I append herewith the last report made to me by Robert Norris. Nefissa Camp, 27th of February 1931. In view of the extreme difficulty of the task which lies before me in writing to you what I know of the mystery at Stillwater, I take the liberty of copying for you in shortest possible form the account which appeared in the Nefissa Daily under date of 27th of February 1930, exactly a year ago at this writing. Quote, Nefissa Camp, February 27. An as-yet unverified story regarding the town of Stillwater on the Alassie Trail 30 miles above Nelson has come to the editors of the Daily. It is said that no single inhabitant can be found in the village, and the travelers coming through the district can find no signs of anyone having left it. The village was last visited on the night of February 25th, just prior to the storm of that date. On that night, all was as usual, according to all reports. Since then, nothing has been seen of the inhabitants. You will remember this case at once as the unsolved mystery which caused us so much trouble, and which earned us so much undeserved criticism. Something happened here last night which throws a faint light on the Stillwater mystery, affording us some vague clues, but clues of such nature that they can help us not at all, especially so far as staving off press criticism is concerned. But let me tell this from the beginning, just as it happened, and you will be able to see for yourself. I had put up with Dr. Jameson, in whose house at the northern end of the village I had been staying for years whenever I stopped over in Nefissa Camp. I came to the camp in early evening, and had hardly got settled when the thing happened. I had stepped outside for a moment. It was not cold, nor yet particularly warm. A wind was blowing, yet the sky was clear. As I stood there, the wind seemed to rise, and abruptly it grew strikingly cold. I looked up into the sky and saw that many of the stars had been blotted out. Then a black spot came hurtling down to me, and I ran back toward the house. Before I could reach it, however, I found my path blocked. Before me, the figure of a man fell gently into the snowbanks. I stopped, but before I could go to him, another form fell with equal softness on the other side of me. And lastly, a third form came down. But this form did not come gently. It was thrown to the earth with great force. You can imagine my amazement. For a moment, I confess that I did not know just what to do. In that brief space of my hesitation, the sudden wind went down and the sharp cold gave place to the comparative mildness of the early evening. Then I ran to the closest form and ascertained at once that the man was still living and was apparently unhurt. The second, also a man, was likewise unhurt. But the third body was that of a woman. She was stone cold, her skin to the touch was icy to an astounding degree, and she had the appearance of having been dead for a long time. I called Dr. Jameson, and together we managed to get the three into the house. The two men we put to bed immediately, and for the woman we called the coroner, the only other doctor in Navissa camp. We also had to summon other help, and Dr. Jameson called in 2 nurses. A quick examination proved that the men were, as I had conjectured, very little hurt. The same examination disclosed another astonishing point, the identification of these 2 men. You will remember that at about the time of the Stillwater case, on the night of the 25th of February, in fact, 2 men had left Nelson for Stillwater, and had vanished as mysteriously as the inhabitants of that town. The 2 men had given their names in Nelson as Allison Wentworth and James MacDonald. Identification papers found on the bodies of these strange visitors from above proved conclusively that at least 2 of the men who were supposed to have been in Stillwater at the time the mysterious tragedy occurred had returned. For our visitors were none other than Wentworth and MacDonald. You can easily visualize with what anticipation I looked for a solution to the Stillwater mystery from these 2 men when once they regained consciousness. I resolved, in consequence, to keep a bedside watch. The doctors told me that Wentworth showed the best signs of coming out of his unconscious delirium first, and I took my place at his side, one of the nurses ready to take down anything Wentworth might say. Shortly after I had taken my position there, the body of the girl was identified by a resident of Navissa camp who had already heard of her and had come to look at the body. The girl was Irene Masite, the only daughter of the Masite who ran the tavern at Stillwater. This indicated conclusively that the 2 men had been in Stillwater at the time of the inexplicable tragedy which swept its inhabitants off the face of the earth, and very probably were in the tavern at the moment the tragedy occurred, perhaps even talking with this girl. So I thought at the moment. Naturally, I was deeply perplexed as to where the men and the girl might have come from, and also as to why the men were practically unhurt and the girl dead. Dead for a great length of time, said Dr. Jameson, perhaps preserved by the cold. And why and how did the men come gently to the earth, and why was the girl literally dashed to the ground? But all these puzzling questions were for the time being shoved into the background, so eager was I to get at the mystery which surrounded the Stillwater case. As I have already written, I had taken my place beside the bed of Wentworth, and listened eagerly for any hint he might drop in his delirium, for as he became warmed, he began to talk a great deal, though not always intelligibly. Some sentences and phrases could be made out, and these the nurse took down in shorthand. I copy a few of the sentences I heard as we went over the bed. Deathwalker, God of the winds, you who walk on the wind, adoramus te, adoramus te, adoramus te. Destroy these faithless ones, you who walk with death, you who pass above the earth, you who have vanquished the sky. Light gleams from the mosques of Baghdad. Stars are born in the Sahara. Lhasa, lost Lhasa, worship, worship, worship the Lord of the Winds. These enigmatic words were followed by a deep and profound silence, during which the man's breathing struck me as highly irregular. Dr. Jameson, who was there, noticed it also, commenting on it as a bad sign, though there was no intimation as to what might have brought on this sudden irregularity, unless it were some unconscious excitement. The delirious jumble meanwhile continued, even more puzzling than before. Windwalker, disperse the fogs over England, adoramus te. It is too late to escape. Lord of the winds, fly, fly, or he will come. Sacrifice, sacrifice. A sacrifice must be, yes, must be made. Chosen one, Irene. Oh, windwalker, sweep over Italy when the olive trees blossom, and the satyrs of Lebanon blew in the wind, cold-swept Russian steppes over wolf-infested Siberia. Onward to Africa, Africa. Blackwood has written of these things, and there are others. The old ones, elementals, and back to Lang. Lost Lang, hidden Lang, whence sprung Windwalker, and others. Dr. Jameson was much interested in the mention of elementals, and since he appeared to know something of them, I asked him to explain. It seems that there still exists an age-old belief that there are elemental spirits of fire, water, air, and earth, all powerful spirits subject to no one, spirits actually worshipped in some parts of the world. His excitement I thought rather exaggerated, and I shot questions at him. It is very difficult for me to chronicle what came out finally in answer to all my questions. It is something that had been kept carefully away from us, though how it could have been is puzzling to me. Even I hesitated at first to believe Dr. Jameson, though he appears to have known it for some time, and assures me that a number of people could tell odd stories if they wanted to. I remember that several anonymous reports of a highly suggestive nature were turned into us, but I hardly dared suspect what lay behind them at the time. It seems that the inhabitants of Stillwater to a body performed a curious worship, not of any god we know, but of something they called an air elemental. A large thing, I am told, vaguely like a man, yet infinitely unlike him. Details are very distorted and unreliable. It is said to have been an air elemental, but there are weird hints of something of incredible age that rose out of hidden fastness in the far north, from a frozen and impenetrable plateau up there. Of this, I can venture nothing. Dr. Jameson mentions a plateau of Lang of which I have never heard, save in the incoherent babblings of Wentworth. But what is most horrible, most unbelievable, in the mystery of this strange communal worship, is the suggestion that the people of Stillwater made human sacrifices to their strange god. There are queer stories of some gigantic thing that these people summoned to their deeply hidden forest altars, and still weirder tales of something seen against the sky in the glare of huge pine fires burning near Stillwater by travelers on the Olassie Trail. How much credence it is advisable to give these stories, you must decide for yourself. For I am, frankly, in view of later developments which I will chronicle in their order, unable to give any opinion. Dr. Jameson, whom I regard as a man of great intelligence, assures me that the elemental stories are sincerely believed hereabouts, and admitted to my surprise that he himself was unwilling to condemn belief without adequate knowledge. This was, in effect, admitting that he himself might believe in them. The man Wentworth suddenly became conscious, and I turned from Dr. Jameson. He asked, naturally, where he was, and he was told. He did not seem surprised. He then asked what year this was, and when we told him, he expressed only an irritated surprise. He murmured something about an even year then, and aroused our interest in the more. "And MacDonald?" he asked then. "Here," we answered. "How did he come?" he asked. "He fell from the sky." "Unhurt?" He puzzled over this for a moment. Then he said, "He put us down then." "There was a girl with you," said Dr. Jameson. "She was dead," he answered in a tired voice. Then he turned his strangely burning eyes on me and asked, "You saw him? You saw the thing that walked on the wind? Then he will return for you, for none can see him and escape." We waited for a few moments, thinking to give him time to become more fully conscious. But alas, he lapsed into a semi-conscious state. It was then that Dr. Jameson, after another examination, announced that the man was dying. This was naturally a great shock to me, and this shock was emphasized when Dr. Jameson added that the man MacDonald would in all probability die without ever gaining consciousness. The doctor could not guess at the cause of death beyond referring vaguely to an assumption that perhaps these men had become so inured to cold that they could no longer stand warmth. At first, I could not guess the significance of that statement, but it came to me suddenly that Dr. Jameson was simply accepting the notion, which had occurred to all of us, that these two men had spent the year just past above the earth, perhaps in a region so cold that warmth would now affect them in the same manner as extreme cold. Despite Wentworth's semi-conscious state, I questioned him, and, surprisingly enough, got a rather jumbled story, which I have pieced together as well as I could from the notes the nurse took, and from my own memory. It appears that these two men, Wentworth and MacDonald, had got into Stillwater quite late, owing to a sudden storm which had come up and put them off the trail for a short time. They were eyed with distinct disfavor at the tavern, but insisted on remaining for the night, which the tavern keeper, Massetti, did not seem to like. But he gave them a room, requesting them to remain in it and to keep away from the window. To this they agreed, despite the fact that they regarded the landlord's proposal as somewhat out of the ordinary. They had hardly come into the room when the innkeeper's daughter, this girl, Irene, came in, and asked them to get her away from the town quickly. She had been chosen, she said, to be sacrificed to Ithaqua, the wind-walking elemental which the Stillwater people are said to have worshipped, and she had decided that she would flee, rather than die for a pagan god of whose existence even she was not too sure. Yet, the girl's fear must have been convincing enough to impress the two men into going away with her. The inhabitants had, recently, it seems, been working against the thing they had worshipped, and its anger had been felt, because that night was the night of sacrifice. Strangers were frowned upon. According to suggestions Wentworth made, he discovered that the Stillwater people had great altars in the pine forests nearby, and that they worshipped the thing they called variously Deathwalker or Windwalker at these altars. Though you can imagine my skeptical view of this entire matter, this does seem to tie up with the stories of giant fires which Dr. Jameson mentioned travelers on the Olassie Trail as having seen. There was also some very incoherent mumbling about the thing itself. Vague and horrible thoughts which seemed to obsess Wentworth. Something about the towering height of the thing seen against the sky in the hellish glow of the nocturnal fires. Exactly what happened? I hardly dare venture to guess at. Out of Wentworth's incoherent and troubled speech, there came only one positive statement, the substance of which was simply that the three of them, Wentworth, MacDonald, and the girl, did flee the sacrificial fires and the village, and had been caught on the Olassie Trail on the way to Nelson by the thing, which had picked them up and carried them along. After this statement, Wentworth became steadily more and more incoherent. He babbled a horrible story of the thing that swooped down after them as they fled in terror along the Olassie Trail. And he blurted out, too, some terrible details of the mystery at Stillwater. From what I can make out, The thing that walked on the wind must have avenged itself on the villagers not only for their previous coldness towards it, but also because of the flight of Irene Masite, who had been chosen for the sacrifice. At any rate, between hysterical wails and shuddering adulations of the thing, there emerged from Wentworth's distorted speech a graphic and terrible picture of a giant monstrosity that came into the village from the forest, sweeping the people into the sky, seeking them out, one by one. I don't know how much of this I should chronicle for you, since I can understand what your attitude must be. Could it have been some animal, do you think? Some prehistoric animal which had lain hidden for years in the depths of the pine forest near Stillwater, that perhaps had been preserved alive by the cold and revived again by the warmth of the giant fires to become the god of the mad Stillwater people. This seems to me the only other logical explanation, but there still remain so many things not yet accounted for that I think it would be much better to leave the Stillwater mystery among the unsolved cases. MacDonald died this morning at 10:07. Wentworth had not spoken since dawn, but he resumed shortly after MacDonald's death, repeating again the same vague sentences which we first heard from him. His incoherent murmurings leave us no alternative in regard to where he spent the past year. He seems to believe that he was carried along by the wind thing, this air elemental, though it is fairly certain that neither of the missing men was anywhere reported throughout the past year. This story may be simply the product of an overburdened mind, a mind suffering from great shock, and the seemingly vast knowledge of the hidden places of the earth, as well as the known, may have been derived from books. I say may have been derived because in view of Wentworth's suggestive, almost convincing murmurings, it becomes only a tentative possibility. I know of no book which chronicles the mystic rites of the Lamasery in Tibet, which tells of the secret ceremonies of the Lhasa monks, nor do I know of any book which reveals the hidden life of the African impi, nor of any pamphlet or monograph even so much as hinting at the forbidden and accursed designs of the Chukcho people of Burma, nor of anything ever written which suggests that there are strange, hybrid men living under the snow and ice of Antarctica, that there exists today a lost kingdom of the sea, a cursed Rylye, where slumbering Cthulhu deep in the earth beneath the sea is waiting to rise and destroy the world. Nor have I ever heard of the shunned and forbidden plateau of Leng, where the ancient ones once ruled. Please do not think I exaggerate. I have never heard of these things before, yet Wentworth speaks as if he had been there, even hinting that these mysterious people have fed him. Of Lhasa I have heard vague hints, and of course, I do remember having once seen a cinema containing what the producer called shots of Africa's vanishing impi. But of the other things, I know nothing. And if I can assume anything from the shuddering horror in Wentworth's semi-conscious voice as he spoke of these hidden things, I do not want to know anything. There was a constant reference, too, in Wentworth's mutterings, to a Blackwood, by whom he evidently meant the writer, Algernon Blackwood, a man who had spent some time here in Canada, says Dr. Jameson. The doctor gave me one of this man's books, pointing out to me several strange stories of air elementals, stories remarkably similar in character to the curious Stillwater mystery, yet nothing so paradoxically definite and vague. I can refer you to these stories if you do not already know them. The doctor also gave me several old magazines in which are stories by an American, a certain H.P. Lovecraft, which have to do with Cthulhu, with the lost sea kingdom of Rylye, and the forbidden plateau of Leng. Perhaps these are the sources of Wentworth's apparently authentic information, yet in none of these stories appears any of the horrific details of which Wentworth speaks so familiarly. Wentworth died at 3:21 this afternoon. An hour before, he passed into a coma from which he did not emerge again. Dr. Jameson and the coroner seemed to think that the exposure of warmth had killed the two men, Jameson telling me candidly that a year with the Windwalker had so inured the men to cold that warmth like ours affected them as extreme cold would affect us normal men. You must understand that Dr. Jameson was entirely serious. Yet, His medical report read that the 2 men and the girl had died from exposure to the cold. In explanation, he said, "I may think what I please, Norris, and I may believe what I please, but I dare not write it." Then, after a pause, he said, "And if you are wise, you will withhold the names of these people from the general public, because questions are certain to arise once they become known. And how are you people going to explain their coming to us from the sky and where they spent the year since the Stillwater mystery? And finally, how are you going to react against the storm of criticism which will fall on you once more when the Stillwater case is reopened with such strangely unbelievable facts as we have gathered here from the lips of a dying man?" I think Dr. Jameson is right. I have no opinion to offer. Absolutely none. And I am making this report only because it is my duty as an officer to do so, and I am making it only to you. Perhaps it had better be destroyed, rather than kept in our files from which it might at some future time be resurrected by a careless official or an inquiring newspaper man. As I have already told you, any opinion that I would have to offer would be worthless. But, in closing, I want to point out 2 things to you. I want to refer you to the first report of Peter Herrick, in charge of the investigation at Stillwater last year, under date of 3rd March, 1930. One quote from the report which I have at hand. "On the Olassie Trail, about 3 miles below Stillwater, we came upon the meandering tracks of 3 people. An examination of the tracks seemed to indicate that there were 2 men and 1 woman. A dog sled had been left behind along the trail, and for some inexplicable reason these 3 people had started running along the trail toward Nelson, evidently away from Stillwater. The tracks halted abruptly, and there was no trace of where they might have gone. Since there had been no snow since the night of the Stillwater mystery, this is doubly puzzling. It is as if the 3 people had been lifted off the earth. Another puzzling factor is the appearance, far off to one side of this point in the trail, in a line with the wandering footsteps of the 3 travelers, of a huge imprint, closely resembling the foot of a man, but certainly a giant, which appears to have been made by an unbelievably large thing. And the foot, though that of a man, must have been webbed." End quote. To this, I want to add some information of my own. I remember that last night, when I threw that startled glance into the sky and saw that the stars had been blotted out. I thought that the cloud which had obscured the sky looked curiously like the outline of a great man. And I remember, too, that where the top of the cloud must have been, where the head of the thing should have been, there were 2 gleaming stars, visible despite the shadow. 2 gleaming stars burning bright, like eyes. One more thing. This afternoon, a half-mile behind Dr. Jameson's house, I came upon a deep depression in the snow. I did not need a second glance to tell me what it was. A half-mile on the other side of the house, there is another imprint like this. I am only thankful that the sun is rapidly distorting the outlines, for I am only too willing to believe that I have imagined them. For they are the imprints of gigantic feet, and the feet must have been webbed. Thus ends Robert Norris's strange report. Because he carried it for some time with him, I did not receive the report until after I had learned of his disappearance. The report was posted to me on the 6th of March. Under date of March 5th, Norris had scrawled a final brief and terrible message in a hand which is barely legible. 5 March. Something is pursuing me. Not a night has passed since the occurrence at Navissa Camp to give me any rest. Always I have felt strange, horrible, yet invisible eyes looking down at me from above. And I remember Wentworth saying that none could live who had seen the thing that walked on the wind, and I cannot forget the sight of it against the sky, and its burning eyes looking down like stars in the haunted night. It is waiting. It was this brief paragraph which caused our official physician to declare that Robert Norris had lost his mind, and had wandered away to some hidden place from which he emerged months later, only to die in the snow. I want to add a few words of my own. Robert Norris did not, lose his mind. Furthermore, Robert Norris was one of the most thorough, the keenest men under my orders. And even during the terrible months he spent in far places, I am sure he did not lose possession of his senses. I grant our physician only one thing. Robert Norris had gone away to some hidden place for those months. But that hidden place was not in Canada. No, nor in North America, whatever our physician may think. I arrived at Navissa Camp by plane within 10 hours of the discovery of Robert Norris's body. As I flew over the spot where the body was found, I saw far away on either side deep depressions in the snow. I have no doubt what they were. It was I, too, who searched Norris's clothes and found in his pockets the mementos he had brought with him from the hidden places where he had been. The gold plaque, depicting in miniature a struggle between ancient beings, and bearing on its surface inscriptions in weird designs. The plaque, which Dr. Spencer of the Quebec University affirms must have come from some place incredibly old, yet is excellently preserved. The incredible geological fragment which, confined in any walled place, gives off the growing hum and roar of winds far, far beyond the rim of the known universe. Robert Armstrong had walked just over 2 miles, as far as he could judge, when his torch failed. He stood still for a moment, unable to believe that such a misfortune could have really befallen him. Then, half maddened with rage, he hurled the useless instrument away. It landed somewhere in the darkness, disturbing the silence of this little world. A metallic echo came ringing back from the low hills. Then all was quiet again. This, thought Armstrong, was the ultimate misfortune. Nothing more could happen to him now. He was even able to laugh bitterly at his luck, and resolved never again to imagine that the fickle goddess had ever favored him. Who would have believed that the only tractor at Camp 4 would have broken down when he was just setting off for Port Sanderson? He recalled the frenzied repair work, the relief when the second start had been made, and the final debacle when the Caterpillar track had jammed. It was no use then regretting the lateness of his departure. He could not have foreseen these accidents, and it was still a good 4 hours before the Canopus took off. He had to catch her, whatever happened. No other ship would be touching at this world for another month. Apart from the urgency of his business, 4 more weeks on this out-of-the-way planet were unthinkable. There had been only one thing to do. It was lucky that Port Sanderson was little more than 6 miles from the camp, not a great distance, even on foot. He had to leave all his equipment behind, but he could follow on the next ship and he could manage without it. The road was poor, merely stamped out of the rock by one of the board's 100-ton crushers, but there was no fear of going astray. Even now, he was in no real danger, though he might well be too late to catch the ship. Progress would be slow, for he dare not risk losing the road in this region of canyons and enigmatic tunnels that had never been explored. It was, of course, pitch dark. Here at the edge of the galaxy, the stars were so few and scattered that their light was negligible. The strange crimson sun of this lonely world would not rise for many hours, and although 5 of the little moons were in the sky, they could barely be seen by the unaided eye. Not one of them could even cast a shadow. Armstrong was not the man to bewail his luck for long. He began to walk slowly along the road, feeling its texture with his feet. It was, he knew, fairly straight except where it wound through Carver's Pass. He wished he had a stick or something to probe the way before him, but he would have had to rely for guidance on the feel of the ground. It was terribly slow at first, until he gained confidence. He had never known how difficult it was to walk in a straight line. Although the feeble stars gave him his bearings, again and again he found himself stumbling among the virgin rocks at the edge of the crude roadway. He was traveling in long zigzags that took him to alternate sides of the road. Then he would stub his toes against the bare rock and grope his way back onto the hard-packed surface once again. Presently, it settled down to a routine. It was impossible to estimate his speed. He could only struggle along and hope for the best. There were 4 miles to go. 4 miles and as many hours. It should be easy enough, unless he lost his way. But he dared not think of that. Once he mastered the technique, he could afford the luxury of thought. He could not pretend that he was enjoying this experience, but he had been in much worse positions before. As long as he remained on the road, he was perfectly safe. He had been hoping that as his eyes became adapted to the starlight, he would be able to see the way, but he now knew that the whole journey would be blind. The discovery gave him a vivid sense of his remoteness from the heart of the galaxy. On a night as clear as this, the skies of almost any other planet would have been blazing with stars. Here, at this outpost of the universe, the sky held perhaps 100 faintly gleaming points of light, as useless as the 5 ridiculous moons on which no one had bothered ever to land. A slight change in the road interrupted his thoughts. Was there a curve here, or had he veered off to the right again? He moved very slowly along the invisible and ill-defined border. Yes, there was no mistake. The road was bending to the left. He tried to remember its appearance in the daytime, but he had only seen it once before. Did this mean he was nearing the pass? He hoped so, for the journey would then be half completed. He peered ahead into the blackness, but the ragged line of the horizon told him nothing. Presently, he found that the road had straightened itself again, and his spirits sank. The entrance to the pass must still be some way ahead. There were at least 4 miles to go. 4 miles. How ridiculous the distance seemed. How long would it take the Canopus to travel 4 miles? He doubted if man could measure so short an interval of time. And how many trillions of miles had he, Robert Armstrong, traveled in his life? It must have reached a staggering total by now, for in the last 20 years he had scarcely stayed more than a month at a time on any single world. This very year, he had twice made the crossing of the galaxy, and that was a notable journey even in these days of the Phantom Drive. He tripped over a loose stone, and the jolt brought him back to reality. It was no use here thinking of ships that could eat up the light years. He was facing nature, with no weapons but his own strength and skill. It was strange that it took him so long to identify the real cause of his uneasiness. The last 4 weeks had been very full, and the rush of his departure, coupled with the annoyance and anxiety caused by the tractor's breakdowns, had driven everything else from his mind. Moreover, he had always prided himself on his hard-headedness and lack of imagination. Until now, he had forgotten all about that first evening at the base, when the crews had regaled him with the usual tall yarns concocted for the benefit of newcomers. It was then that the old base clerk had told the story of his walk by night from Port Sanderson to the camp, and of what had trailed him through Carver's Pass, keeping always beyond the limit of his torchlight. Armstrong, who had heard such tales on a score of worlds, had paid it little attention at the time. This planet, after all, was known to be uninhabited. But logic could not dispose of the matter as easily as that. Suppose, after all, there was some truth in the old man's fantastic tale. It was not a pleasant thought, and Armstrong did not intend to brood upon it. But he knew that if he dismissed it out of hand, it would continue to prey on his mind. The only way to conquer imaginary fears was to face them boldly. He would have to do that now. His strongest argument was the complete barrenness of this world and its utter desolation. Though against that, one could set many counter-arguments, as indeed the old clerk had done. Man had only lived on this planet for 20 years, and much of it was still unexplored. No one could deny that the tunnels out in the wasteland were rather puzzling, but everyone believed them to be volcanic vents. Though, of course, life often crept into such places. With a shudder, he remembered the giant polyps that had snared the first explorers of Vargon 3. It was all very inconclusive. Suppose, for the sake of argument, one granted the existence of life here. What of that? The vast majority of life forms in the universe were completely indifferent to man. Some, of course, like the gas beings of Alcoran or the roving wave lattices of Chandaloon, could not even detect him, but passed through or around him as if he did not exist. Others were merely inquisitive, some embarrassingly friendly. There were few indeed that would attack unless provoked. Nevertheless, it was a grim picture that the old store's clerk had painted. Back in the warm, well-lighted smoking room, with the drinks going round, it had been easy enough to laugh at. But here, in the darkness, miles from any human settlement, it was very different. It was almost a relief when he stumbled off the road again and had to grope with his hands until he found it once more. This seemed a very rough patch, and the road was scarcely distinguishable from the rocks around. In a few minutes, however, he was safely on his way again. It was unpleasant to see how quickly his thoughts returned to the same disquieting subject. Clearly, it was worrying him more than he cared to admit. He drew consolation from one fact. It had been quite obvious that no one at the base had believed the old fellow's story. Their questions and banter had proved that. At times, he had laughed as loudly as any of them. After all, what's the evidence? A dim shape just seen in the darkness that might as well have been an oddly formed rock. And the curious clicking noise that had so impressed the old man, anyone could imagine such sounds at night if they were sufficiently overwrought. If it had been hostile, why hadn't the creature come any closer? Because it was afraid of my light, the old chap had said. Well, that was plausible enough. He would explain why nothing had ever been seen in the daylight. Such a creature might live underground, only emerging at night. Damn it, why was he taking the old idiot's raving so seriously? Armstrong got in control of his thoughts again. If he went on his way, he told himself angrily, he would soon be seeing and hearing a whole menagerie of monsters. There was, of course, one factor that disposed of the ridiculous story at once. It was really very simple. He felt sorry he hadn't thought of it before. What would such a creature live on? There was not even a trace of vegetation on the whole of the planet. He laughed to think that that bogey could be disposed of so easily, and in the same instant felt annoyed with himself for not laughing aloud. If he was so sure of his reasoning, why not whistle, or sing, or do anything to keep up his spirits? He put the question fairly to himself as a test of his manhood. Half ashamed, he had to admit that he was still afraid. Afraid because there might be something in it after all. But at least his analysis had done him some good. It would have been better if he had left it there and remained half convinced by his argument. But a part of his mind was still trying to break down his careful reasoning. It succeeded only too well, and when he remembered the plant beings of Sandil Major, the shock was so unpleasant that he stopped dead in his tracks. Now, the plant beings of Xantil were not in any way horrible. They were, in fact, extremely beautiful creatures. But what made them appear so distressing now was the knowledge that they could live for indefinite periods with no food whatsoever. All the energy that they needed for their strange lives, they extracted from cosmic radiation. And that was almost as intense here as anywhere else in the universe. He had scarcely thought of one example before others crowded into his mind, and he remembered the life form on Trantor Beta, which was the only one known capable of directly utilizing atomic energy. That too had lived on an utterly barren world, very much like this. Armstrong's mind was rapidly splitting into two distinct portions, each trying to convince the other and neither wholly succeeding. He did not realize how far his morale had gone until he found himself holding his breath, lest it conceal any sound from the darkness about him. Angrily, he cleared his mind of the rubbish that had been gathering there and turned once more to the immediate problem. There was no doubt that the road was slowly rising, and the silhouette of the horizon seemed much higher in the sky. The road began to twist, and suddenly he was aware of great rocks on either side of him. Soon, only a narrow ribbon of sky was still visible, and the darkness became, if possible, even more intense. Somehow, he felt safer with the rock walls surrounding him. It meant that he was protected except in two directions. Also, the road had been leveled more carefully and it was very easy to keep it. Best of all, he knew now that the journey was more than half completed. For a moment, his spirits began to rise. Then, with maddening perversity, his mind went back into the old grooves again. He remembered that it was on the far side of Carver's Pass that the old clerk's adventure had taken place, if it had ever happened at all. In half a mile, he would be out in the open again, out of the protection of these sheltering rocks. The thought seemed doubly horrible now, and he already felt a sense of nakedness. He could be attacked from any direction, and he would be utterly helpless. Until now, he had retained some self-control. Very resolutely, he had kept his mind away from the one fact that gave some color to the old man's tale. The single piece of evidence that had stopped the banter in the crowded room back at the camp and brought a sudden hush upon the company. Now, as Armstrong's will weakened, he recalled again the words that had struck a momentary chill, even the warm comfort of the base building. The little clerk had been very insistent on one point. He had never heard any sound of pursuit from the dim shape sensed, rather than seen at the limit of his light. There was no scuffling of claws or hoof on rock, not even the clatter of displaced stones. It was as if, so the old man had declared in that solemn manner of his, as if that thing was following could see perfectly in the darkness, and had many small legs or pads so that it could move swiftly and easily over the rock, like a giant caterpillar or one of the carpet things of Kralkor 2. Yet, although there had been no noise of pursuit, there had been one sound that the old man had caught several times. It was so unusual that its very strangeness made it doubly ominous. It was a faint, but horribly persistent clicking. The old fellow had been able to describe it very vividly, much too vividly for Armstrong's liking now. "Have you ever listened to a large insect crunching its prey?" he said. "Well, it was just like that. I imagine that a crab makes exactly the same noise with its claws when it clashes them together. It was what's the word? A chitinous sound." At this point, Armstrong remembered laughing loudly. Strange how it was all coming back to him now. But no one else had laughed, though they had been quick to do so earlier. Sensing the change of tone, he had sobered at once and asked the old man to continue his story. How he wished now that he had stifled his curiosity. It had been quickly told. The next day, a party of skeptical technicians had gone into the no man's land beyond Carver's Pass. They were not skeptical enough to leave their guns behind, but they had no cause to use them, for they found no trace of any living thing. There were the inevitable pits and tunnels, glistening holes down which the light of the torches rebounded endlessly until it was lost in the distance. But the planet was riddled with them. Though the party found no sign of life, it discovered one thing it did not like at all. Out in the barren and unexplored land beyond the pass, they had come upon an even larger tunnel than the rest. Near the mouth of that tunnel was a massive rock, half embedded in the ground, and the sides of that rock had been worn away, as if it had been used as an enormous whetstone. No less than 5 of those present had seen this disturbing rock. None of them could explain it satisfactorily as a natural formation, but they still refused to accept the old man's story. Armstrong had asked them if they had ever put it to the test. There had been an uncomfortable silence. Then big Andrew Hargraves had said, "Hell, who'd walk out to the pass at night just for fun?" and had left it at that. Indeed, there was no other record of anyone walking from Port Sanderson to the camp by night, or for that matter by day. During the hours of light, no unprotected human being could live in the open beneath the rays of the enormous, lurid sun that seemed to fill half the sky. And no one would walk 6 miles wearing radiation armor if the tractor was available. Armstrong felt he was leaving the pass. The rocks on either side were falling away, and the road was no longer as firm and well-packed as it had been. He was coming out into the open plain once more, and somewhere not far away in the darkness, was that enigmatic pillar that might have been used for sharpening monstrous fangs or claws. It was not a reassuring thought, but he could not get it out of his mind. Feeling distinctly worried now, Armstrong made great effort to pull himself together. He would try to be rational again. He would think of business, the work he had done at the camp, anything but this infernal place. For a while he succeeded quite well. But presently, with a maddening persistence, every train of thought came back to the same point. He could not get out of his mind the picture of that inexplicable rock and its appalling possibilities. Over and over again he found himself wondering how far away it was, whether he had already passed it, and whether it was on his right or his left. The ground was quite flat again, and the road drove on straight as an arrow. There was one gleam of consolation. Port Sanderson could not be much more than 2 miles away. Armstrong had no idea how long he had been on the road. Unfortunately, his watch was not illuminated, and he could only guess at the passage of time. With any luck, the Canopus should not take off for another 2 hours at least. But he could not be sure, and now another fear began to enter his mind. The dread that he might see a vast constellation of lights rising swiftly into the sky ahead, and know that all this agony of mind had been in vain. He was not zigzagging so badly now, and seemed to be able to anticipate the edge of the road before stumbling off it. It was probable, he cheered himself by thinking, that he was travelling almost as fast as if he had a light. If all went well, he might be nearing Port Sanderson in 30 minutes, a ridiculously small space of time. How he would laugh at his fears when he strolled into his already reserved stateroom in the Canopus, and felt that peculiar quiver as the Phantom Drive hurled the great ship far out of this system, back to the clustered star clouds near the center of the galaxy. Back toward Earth itself, which he had not seen for so many years. One day, he told himself, he really must visit Earth again. All his life he had been making the promise, but always there had been the same answer. Lack of time. Strange, wasn't it? That such a tiny planet should have played so enormous a part in the development of the universe. Should even have come to dominate worlds far wiser and more intelligent than itself. Armstrong's thoughts were harmless again, and he felt calmer. The knowledge that he was nearing Port Sanderson was immensely reassuring, and he deliberately kept his mind on familiar, unimportant matters. Carver's past was already far behind, and with it that thing he no longer intended to recall. One day, if he ever returned to this world, he would visit the past in the daytime and laugh at his fears. In 20 minutes now, they would have joined the nightmares of his childhood. It was almost a shock, though one of the most pleasant he had ever known, when he saw the lights of Port Sanderson come up over the horizon. The curvature of this little world was very deceptive. It did not seem right that a planet with a gravity almost as great as Earth's should have a horizon so close at hand. One day, someone would have to discover what lay at this world's core to give it so great a density. Perhaps the many tunnels would help. It was an unfortunate turn of thought, but the nearness of his goal had robbed it of its terror. Indeed, the thought that he might really be in danger seemed to give his adventure a certain piquancy and heightened interest. Nothing could happen to him now, with 10 minutes to go and the lights of the port already in sight. A few minutes later, his feelings changed abruptly when he came to the sudden bend in the road. He had forgotten the chasm that caused his detour, and added half a mile to the journey. Well, what of it? He thought stubbornly. An extra half mile would make no difference now. Another 10 minutes at the most. It was very disappointing when the lights of the city vanished. Armstrong had not remembered the hill which the road was skirting. Perhaps it was only a low ridge, scarcely noticeable in the daytime. But by hiding the lights of the port, it had taken away his chief talisman and left him again at the mercy of his fears. Very unreasonably, his intelligence told him, he began to think of how horrible it would be if anything happened now, so near the end of the journey. He kept the worst of his fears at bay for a while, hoping desperately that the lights of the city would soon reappear. But as the minutes dragged on, he realized that the ridge must be longer than he imagined. He tried to cheer himself by the thought that the city would be all the nearer when he saw it again. But somehow logic seemed to have failed him now. But presently he found himself doing something he had not stopped to. even out in the waste by Carver's past. He stopped, turned slowly round, and with bated breath listened until his lungs were nearly bursting. The silence was uncanny, considering how near he must be to the port. There was certainly no sound from behind him. Of course there wouldn't be, he told himself angrily, but he was immensely relieved. The thought of that faint and insistent clicking had been haunting him for the last hour. So friendly and familiar was the noise that did reach him at last that the anticlimax almost made him laugh aloud. Drifting through the still air from a source clearly not more than a mile away came the sound of a landing field tractor, perhaps one of the machines loading the Canopus itself. In a matter of seconds, thought Armstrong, he would be around this ridge with the port only a few hundred yards ahead. The journey was nearly ended. In a few moments, this evil plane would be no more than a fading nightmare. It seemed terribly unfair. So little time, such a small fraction of a human life, was all he needed now. But the gods have always been unfair to man, and now they were enjoying their little jest. For there could be no mistaking the rattle of monstrous claws in the darkness ahead of him. Alright, I'm keeping the lights on and staying far the hell away from any windy towns. No sky giants or unseen horrors are gonna get Everett. No, sir. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out some of our other transmissions. We're editing them regularly, and we'd love to have you as part of the Dusklight family by subscribing, hitting the bell of cosmic horror, and leave a comment with stories you'd love for my many-legged runners to find. It's time to prostrate ourselves and give special thanks to our Patreon subscribers. Our Sturgeonite faithfuls Haley Clark, Foe, Sabrina Alexander and Laree W., Purple Crayon Eater Mary Peck, our janitors Alex Nunez and Ethan Nelson, Feeny Von Karma, Amy Shawn, and Arkham Cookie, currently undergoing the Magenta Horror, our Void Walker Evan Diaz, currently unlocking something he calls the God Weight, and who also made an excellent broadcast suggestion for a future subscriber milestone we are seriously considering. And one of our very own Blackwell family members, Papa Kyle Blackwell, who just challenged one Paint Gunkerson to a paint-off at the end of the winter solstice. Papa Kyle was imbued with the strength of his patron and the birth of his newborn baby, Aria, so I suspect he will have the edge on paint. Major congratulations to you and your family. We love and fear you, Papa. We thank you all humbly for your patronage and look to see you bright and early for Dusklight orientation. Purple crayons and existential dread will be provided. If you want to be a patron, we have a link in the description below. You'll get early access to all videos, exclusive Sturgeon-focused stories, D&D and Monster of the Week content ahead of time, and more. And, one last time, listeners, close your eyes and breathe with me. Remember, no matter how bad things are, how cruel people can be, and how heavy your shoulders may feel with the weight of the world bearing down on them, Dusklight will always be here to lift the load and provide you with some respite, even if occasionally we miss the schedule. Drink some water, watch a video about tree frogs, eat something savory, and sleep on the cool side of the pillow with the window open and the stars twinkling down on you. Start and end each day with kindness in your heart. You matter, you are loved, and every day is another chance. I'll see you again when the sun sets and dusk enters the station.